You know that feeling. It's almost indescribable sometimes. A piece of music just hits you, and suddenly you're transported somewhere else entirely. Maybe it's a soaring melody that fills you with, I don't know, hope. Or maybe a deep pulsing rhythm that just moves you physically, emotionally.
Right, even without any words.
Exactly. It could be purely instrumental, no words at all, but it resonates with something really profound inside you. It's definitely more than just sound waves hitting your ears, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
But what is that more?
Yeah.
What actually makes music, well, music?
That's precisely the kind of captivating question we're planning to take a deep dive into today. We're venturing into the fascinating world of musical aesthetics.
Okay.
And we'll be guided primarily by the really profound insights of the philosopher Roger Scruton, particularly looking at his big work, The Aesthetics of Music.
Right, Scruton. So our mission today is to really try and unpack what music truly is. How do we understand it beyond just, passively hearing sounds?
Yeah, and what does its deep connection to our inner lives, even to the very fabric of our culture, what does that reveal about us?
This isn't just about theory, is it?
Yeah.
It sounds like a journey that might challenge our everyday assumptions about this art form we all love. It might even change how you listen to music from now on.
I think it really could. We'll be drawing pretty extensively from excerpts of Scruton's work, and he provides this incredibly meticulous framework for exploring these questions.
Yeah.
And, Scruton's approach to musical philosophy is quite distinct. It's different from some other philosophers who were maybe also composers, like Nietzsche or Adorno, perhaps.
That's so.
Well, Scruton really, he really zeroes in on the core philosophical problems of music itself. He's intensely concerned with that intricate relationship between sound and tone.
Okay.
The nuanced analysis of musical meaning and the very nature of the purely musical experience we all share or can share. He builds on figures like Edward Hanslick and Edmund Gurney, sure,
Yeah.
but he also brings in insights from Gestalt psychologists.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, which really sets his work apart from those maybe more abstract, all-encompassing philosophical systems that only sort of apply incidentally to music. His is an incredibly precise and I think deeply felt analysis.
Okay, so let's dive right in then. Let's unpack this right away with what Scruton considers a really crucial distinction. Sound versus tone.
Yes, foundational.
It might seem like splitting hairs at first, maybe, but he argues there's a whole world of difference. When you think of a sound, you usually think of a physical phenomenon, right? Something produced by vibrations, external, independent of us.
It's like a car horn honking or maybe the clatter of dishes in the kitchen.
Exactly.
Yeah. Those are physical, objective facts. They exist whether we're listening or not.
But tones. Scruton says tones are different.
Very different. Tones are what we hear in those sounds, but only when we perceive them as music. They aren't just the raw vibrations anymore.
Okay, so what are they then?
He calls them intentional objects. Now, what exactly does that mean? Think about something like a character in a novel. Maybe Sherlock Holmes.
Okay, yeah.
Sherlock isn't a physical person walking around London, obviously, but he's a very real object of our thought, our discussion, our imagination. He has properties, a distinct personality, relationships within his fictional world.
Right, I see where you're going.
So in a similar way, Scruton argues, musical tones aren't just physical vibrations. They are real entities in our perception. And they have their own set of purely musical properties like attracting and repelling each other.
Ah, okay. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Tones, in Scruton's view, they occupy positions in what he calls an acousmatic space.
That's the term, acousmatic space.
And in this space, these intentional objects, these tones, they don't just sit there passively. You're saying they attract and repel each other. They carry a kind of mysterious movement.
Exactly. And it's not a physical space you could, point to with your finger. It's a space of our perception, our imagination, our hearing. And to illustrate this really powerfully, Scruton conjures up this image she calls the music room. Imagine you walk into a room and you hear a perfectly pure clarinet. There's no clarinet player there, no person singing, no visible instrument at all. You can't trace the sound back to any specific physical source in the room. This scenario, he argues, highlights how music uniquely exploits what he calls the acousmatic experience. That's the deliberate severing of sound from its direct physical cause.
So detaching sound from source.
Precisely. And modern concert halls, often by concealing the performers, and especially technologies like recording and broadcasting, have profoundly fortified this experience. They allow us to hear music completely detached from its origin.
Right.
In a way, Scruton suggests the entire goal of music, especially Western classical music, is to describe and notate sounds in a way that doesn't need to specify their external physical cause. It focuses purely on what is heard.
That distinction really is foundational, isn't it?
Yeah.
It means that when you're listening to your favorite song, especially, say, a recording through headphones or speakers, you're not just passively receiving vibrations.
Not all.
Your mind is already engaged in this active process of perception, of interpretation. You're engaging with this acousmatic reality where the sound isn't tied to its physical source, but exists as a tone, a musical entity in its own right within this perceived space.
Mm-hmm.
It fundamentally changes how you think about just hitting play on your phone, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It suggests a much deeper mental construction is happening when we listen.
Absolutely. And this leads us directly to what Scruton terms the objective reality of phenomenal sound.
Okay, phenomenal sound. What's that?
He argues that the objective reality of the sound we hear in music is phenomenal and intrinsic, which means, well, it means it's not dependent on some abiding stuff, as he puts it, not some external, tangible source in the material world that we could touch or see.
So the reality is in the experience.
Exactly. The distinction between a real sound, like, say, middle C truly sounding in that music room, and an apparent sound, like maybe hallucinating middle C, can be drawn entirely at this phenomenal level within our experience itself.
So how does he ground that? How do we know it's objective if it's just experience?
Good question. He says, if middle C is really sounding in the music room, to use his example again, that implies that any normal observer, under normal conditions, would hear it.
Ah, okay. What others would hear test.
Precisely. This counterfactual condition, what would be heard by others, is what grounds the distinction between real and apparent sound. It's similar in a way to how we distinguish a real color from an apparent one. If everyone sees the same red under normal light, we generally accept it's real.
Okay, but he says there's a difference with sound.
Yes, a crucial difference from colors. Unlike colors, which we usually see as qualities of things, like the redness of an apple, sounds, when heard as music, are presented as independently existing objects.
Independently existing.
They don't seem to need a physical thing to which they belong in the same way. Their reality is internal to their appearance. Therefore, there's no abiding stuff of which they are predicated in the same way we might talk about the material composition that makes something red.
Wow.
The sound itself, as a perceived phenomenon, is real and objective in its own right for all normal observers to hear.
This really helps us understand why music, even coming from unseen speakers or tiny headphones, can be so deeply affecting, so powerful. The experience isn't just some subjective illusion that only exists for you. It's inherently real, a shared part of our perception, even if its source is totally invisible. It exists phenomenally in our experience of it.
And that experience is objective in the sense that it's reliably shared among normal observers.
So the next time you're really immersed in a piece, you can know that what you're hearing is a profoundly real, shared phenomenon. That's quite something. Okay, so now we've established what music is. In Scruton's view, this acousmatic, phenomenal reality. How do we move to how we actually perceive its fundamental qualities? Let's delve into the building blocks. Pitch and rhythm.
Right, the basics.
When we discuss pitch, Scruton points out there are two important ways to think about it, two forms of organization. On one hand, you've got the physical continuum of frequencies. That's the science bit, the acoustics.
Yeah, wavelengths, hertz, stuff you can measure with equipment. That's the raw data, the physical basis.
But then there's the other form.
The other form is the quasi-spatial arrangement of tones that we actually perceive as musical reality. This involves discrete intervals like steps on a ladder, and crucially, these patterns repeat themselves at the octave.
The octave similarity.
Exactly. That's what we actually hear as music. The physical frequencies are just the raw material, but our minds organize them into something musical, something that exists in that acousmatic space we talked about. We hear higher and lower, not just faster or slower vibrations. It's a perceptual structure.
And then there's rhythm. Okay, most people probably associate rhythm with sounds happening in a regular succession, right? With accents that divide the sequence into definite measures.
That's the common understanding, yeah. It provides that background pulse, that sense of order against which we hear patterns and come to expect repeated emphasis. It's the thing that makes you want to tap your foot or dance.
But Scruton says it's not just about regularity.
No, not strictly. While regularity is often there, rhythm doesn't absolutely require it. He points to one of the most, well, profoundly rhythmical pieces ever written, Stravinsky's Sacrificial Dance from The Rite of Spring.
Oh yeah, that piece is intense.
It is. And it famously dispenses with small-scale repetitions altogether, as Scruton puts it. It's constantly changing time signature and accent with almost every bar.
Yet it's incredibly rhythmic. You feel this powerful drive.
Undeniably. The dense harmony, the almost militaristic orchestration, it drives relentlessly forward, creating this undeniable sense of rhythm, even with the constant shifts. You also hear this kind of dynamic, non-regular rhythm in, say, Varèse's Ionization, which is almost entirely percussion.
Right. No real melody there.
Or the opening of the slow movement of Bartók's Sonata for 2 pianos and percussion, very delicate, but incredibly rhythmic. They create the sense of organized movement, of pulse, even without a clear, unchanging beat. The forward motion, the organized emphasis, it's there, even when unpredictable.
That's fascinating. It means rhythm isn't just some mechanical counting of beats.
Not at all. To hear rhythm, Scruton says, is to hear a kind of animation.
Animation.
Yeah. Beats don't just passively follow one another. He says they bring each other into being, respond to one another, and breathe with a common life. It's a kind of virtual causality, an organization of mental objects.
Wow, virtual causality.
And he says we know this intimately from our own inner experience, the experience of life conscious of itself as life.
That's a really powerful idea. So your sense of rhythm connects to your very sense of being alive, of experiencing time unfolding.
That seems to be the implication. So a complex rhythm might feel like a living, breathing thing, not just a sequence of sounds hitting your ear.
And this rhythmic organization happens on multiple levels.
Oh, yes, often simultaneously. Think of what Scruton calls extended upbeats that prepare for downbeats. In a classic Viennese waltz, for example, you might hear these sort of lazy waltz rhythms mixing with fleeting polkas or even slow marches appearing briefly.
Kind of setting the scene.
Exactly. Setting the scene before the main waltz really kicks in, these could be described as an extended upbeat that prepares you for the downbeat of that first properly danceable bar. It sets a mood before the main pulse takes over. Scruton even playfully asks if the first 3 notes of Strauss's Blue Danube aren't the real upbeat into the waltz, rather than the start of the waltz itself. It's all about how our perception groups things and anticipates what's coming.
You see this brilliantly in big symphonic works too, right? Like the opening of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, the third. Those 2 huge E-flat chords at the very beginning, before the main theme starts sweeping in. Musicologists often talk about those chords functioning as this massive upbeat, right? A gesture that just sets the stage and creates huge anticipation.
Absolutely. Edward Cohn was big on that idea. It shows how a downbeat on one level, like the start of the first measure, can simultaneously be an upbeat on a much grander level, like the beginning of the whole melodic statement or even the whole movement structure.
So the next time you feel the groove or the pulse of a song, you need to remember it's not just the music doing something to you.
Right. You are experiencing this incredibly complex, multi-layered organization. Your mind is actively creating meaning from those patterns, and you're feeling that animation that Scruton describes. It's a really sophisticated interplay between the sound, your perception, and maybe even these deeper patterns of life itself.
Okay, moving on from rhythm and pitch. Let's talk about melody. Melody is probably what most people think of first when they think of music, right? That memorable tune you hum, the bit that gets stuck in your head.
The main event for many listeners, definitely.
But for Scruton, melody is clearly far more than just a sequence of notes strung together. He says it's an organization heard in sound that's not reducible to any properties of the sound, nor to any properties of the vibration that causes it.
Right. It's more than the sum of its parts. It emerges from the sequence.
And this is where it gets philosophically quite deep, isn't it? Hearing melody, for Scruton, requires capacities that only, quote, rational beings have.
Yes. It involves hearing an order that contains no physical information as such, an order that kind of stands apart from the ordinary cause and effect of the material world.
But it has its own causality.
Exactly. Within this perceived order, it contains that virtual causality we mentioned with rhythm. It animates its own elements, giving them a sense of purpose, of direction, of leading somewhere.
Which brings us right to that famously puzzling phenomenon of musical movement. Philosophers have really wrestled with this one.
They really have.
Is it ideal motion, just in the mind, like Gurney suggested, or pure motion, where nothing actually moves, as Zucker-Kandel argued? Bergson called melody a change in which nothing changes.
And Schopenhauer, the great pessimist, saw music as a manifestation of the will, this blind, striving force in the universe where nothing observable is actually striving or moving. It's a deep puzzle. So what is moving when we hear a melody?
So what's Scruton's take?
He clarifies that it's not just change happening over time, but specifically movement. And movement, he argues, needs three things. A spatial frame.
Which is the acousmatic space for music.
Right. Then an occupant of that frame.
The tones.
The tones. And finally, a change of position within that frame. While change can happen in time alone, like temperature changing, melody is change of a particular kind, the change that we know as movement.
Okay.
So musical movement, for Scruton, is the fundamental background reality against which melodies are formed and perceived. It's an illusion, yes, a powerful one, but absolutely central to how we experience music.
And here's another surprising insight Scruton offers.
Yeah.
Melodies don't always have neat, clear starts and stops. Their boundaries can be incredibly fuzzy, permeable.
Permeable is a good word. A melody can sort of seep across into the surrounding material, as he puts it. And what sounds like just an accompanying figure can suddenly become an upbeat or even gradually get absorbed into the main melodic line itself. It blurs the lines of where one thing ends and another begins.
Can you give an example?
A really masterful one he discusses is this slow movement of Beethoven's Fourth Symphony. It starts with this repeated rhythmic figure on a single pitch, a repeated fourth, for a whole bar.
Okay.
Before what seems like the main, more obviously melodic phrase takes over. But when did that melody really begin? Was it at bar 2? Or maybe a quarter beat before? The listener actually has a kind of choice in how they perceive it initially.
A choice.
Yeah, and it's a crucial one because that initial accompanying rhythmic figure is subtly but definitely incorporated into the melody as it unfolds. How you hear the melody depends on how you sort of attribute the history and the future to that rising fourth figure.
Interesting.
Similarly, think about those 4 striking drum beats that open Beethoven's violin concerto. Tap, 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 tap. Are they just a percussive intro?
Right.
Or are they actually part of the melody itself?
Yeah, you can hear it either way at first.
Right. But as the piece develops, you come to understand them as the undeniable leading motif, the very seed from which the whole beautiful movement grows, so perception can shift.
And historically, Scruton notes you can see this developing.
Yeah, he points out how medieval secular music, with its iterated tunes, often have this more continuous, less segmented feel. But then there was a clear move towards the more bounded phrases and distinct motifs that really characterize classical music, a departure from the more unbroken, flowing kind of line you hear in, say, Gregorian chant. It shows a historical shift in how composers and listeners thought about what constitutes a melody.
So when we talk about music moving us or flowing, it's not just a loose metaphor.
Not according to Scruton, it's actually how we experientially construct its reality in that acousmatic space. And the active role of our imaginative perception, your individual choice maybe in hearing when a melody begins or ends, how it develops, that highlights just how involved and creative you are as the listener in constructing the whole musical experience. Your mind isn't passive, it's actively shaping what you hear into meaningful movement.
Okay, let's explore harmony now. Harmony often provides the emotional backbone, maybe, the architectural structure of a lot of music. And Scruton presents a really compelling idea here. Our perception of consonance and dissonance, what sounds nice versus what sounds clashy, is fundamentally culturally and historically dependent.
Yes, this is a major insight. It really challenges any notion that there's some universal, unchanging acoustic truth about what harmonies sound good or bad.
So what sounds dissonant in one era might sound totally fine in another.
Exactly. He says a chord that was clearly dissonant in Haydn may sound consonant in Stravinsky. Think about Mozart's famous dissonance quartet, K465. It got its nickname because its slow introduction had these harmonies that were genuinely shocking, quite jarring to listeners in his time.
But to us now,
To our modern ears, honestly, it no longer sounds nearly as unsettling, maybe a little spicy, but not shocking. Or take Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring again. It's absolutely packed with semitones and warring intervals, creating this really abrasive sound world in places.
famously caused a riot.
Famously did. Yet, for many listeners today, these once scandalous harmonies are often heard as, well, sweetly consonant, might be pushing it for some parts, but certainly entirely acceptable, even exciting within the context of the piece. Our ears adapt, our expectations shift.
And Scruton explains how this happens. How does dissonance lose its sting?
He says the tension introduced by dissonance can be negated.
Yeah.
And it can be negated by several things. Orchestration, rhythm, or, and this is key, by the creation of rival harmonic expectations.
Rival expectations.
Like in jazz.
Jazz is a great example he uses. Accessory notes are constantly added to chords, creating these complex, dense voicings that might technically be dissonant if you just isolated them. But the overall effect often isn't dissonant because, as he puts it, the experience of dissonance has a tendency to vanish.
Why?
Because the context, the improvisation, the rhythmic drive, the way the melody moves through those chords, all these elements radically alter our perception of the individual harmonic tension. The same notes played starkly in a different context would feel entirely different. Okay. And he also takes issue with Schoenberg's idea of the emancipation of the dissonance.
He does, quite strongly. Schoenberg, the pioneer of atonality, talked about emancipating dissonance, meaning dissonant chords no longer needed to resolve to consonant ones. They could just exist freely.
As liberating.
Well, Scruton counters that without the expectation of resolution, a dissonance just stops sounding like a dissonance. It loses its defining characteristic, its feeling of tension needing to go somewhere.
So what does it become?
Instead, he argues, these unresolved dissonances often become aimless, mellifluous wandering, as he hears it in works like Schoenberg's Piano Concerto or Boulet's Le Marteau sans maître.
Aimless wandering. What does he mean by that?
Well, imagine music where almost every sound is equally tense or unresolved. If nothing ever pulls towards a point of stability or rest, then the tension itself kind of loses its meaning, doesn't it? Because there's no release, no dynamic interplay between tension and release, which is what defines dissonance in a musical sense. It's like being perpetually uneasy, but with no narrative arc to that feeling.
I see. It loses its function.
Right. He argues that Schoenberg confused the musical idea of dissonance, which is relational, implying a need for resolution within a system, with the purely acoustical idea of discord, which is just a physical sound event, a clash of frequencies, which is present to some degree in almost all music anyway. He points out that even great tonal masters effectively emancipated certain discords long before Schoenberg, just by using clever voice leading to move away from standard chords in ways that were musically satisfying and didn't always resolve immediately in the obvious way.
That's fascinating because it really shows that our ears, our perception, isn't fixed or universal at all.
Not in the slightest.
Our sense of musical rightness or wrongness, of what sounds pleasing or jarring, is profoundly shaped by the musical traditions and expectations we absorb as listeners. It really challenges us to think about how our own listening habits influence what we find appealing or maybe difficult in music.
Absolutely. And it connects to this idea of our ingrained listening grammar. We naturally expect certain things, symmetries, patterns repeating, notes resolving in familiar ways. Serial music being permutational, arranging sounds based on a preset mathematical order doesn't always feed that elaborational expectation.
Our expectation to hear things build and relate in familiar ways.
Exactly. And cognitive psychology, Scruton notes, actually suggests that these purely permutational arrangements are just intrinsically harder for our brains to process intuitively, to internalize. So if you find some music difficult, it might not just be you. It might be a fundamental mismatch between how the music is organized and how our minds are naturally wired to find structure in sound.
And this also implies that deep musical understanding doesn't necessarily require years of formal theory training.
Not necessarily. It requires a keen ear, an attentive ear, for what is actually heard in the music itself, how those sounds relate to each other, and to our innate ways of processing musical information over time.
Okay, now let's tackle a really big question. How does music communicate? What kind of meaning does it have? Scruton makes a crucial argument here that music is a unique kind of language, fundamentally different from ordinary speech or other arts that represent things. His core idea is that music does not represent, it expresses.
That's the key distinction, expression, not representation. He carefully distinguishes music from representational arts like literature, which obviously refers to things and concepts via language, or painting, which typically represents via resemblance, via its visual content.
So when you look at a portrait,
you recuperate thoughts about something other than themselves. You think about the person depicted, their status, maybe their character. but Scruton argues this isn't true of music in the same way. You can understand a piece like Debussy's La Mer, perfectly well appreciate its structure, its emotional ebb and flow, its sheer beauty, without necessarily hearing it as a literal depiction of the sea's movement.
Even though it's called the sea and clearly evokes it.
Right. It might strongly evoke the sea, suggest it, but it doesn't represent it in the way a seascape painting represents the sea. The musical meaning isn't dependent on recognizing that external reference.
So, if I listen to Mussorgsky's The Great Gate of Kiev from pictures at an exhibition, and I hear what sound like massive cathedral bells and maybe a solemn hymn.
Yeah, those are powerful associations, suggestions, absolutely part of the piece's evocative character. But Scruton's point is that a listener who somehow fails to recognize these external references, who doesn't know it's supposed to be bells or a gate, doesn't necessarily have their fundamental musical understanding diminished.
They can still grasp the musical structure.
Yes, the musical unity of the piece can still be experienced. The grandeur, the culmination, the way the musical elements build, that can still be heard and understood. Even if you miss the specific pictorial association, the music still works on its own internal terms.
And why is music different in this way?
Well, Scruton suggests a deep reason lies in the very nature of sound and perception. While we often identify sounds by their normal causes, we recognize the sound of a car. The sound of rain sounds themselves are not typically appearances of those causes.
What do you mean?
You don't hear the car in its sound in the same direct way you see a face in a picture. Sounds aren't usually organized perceptually as aspects of the things that emit them. We don't perceive the sound as the thing itself in the way we perceive a picture as a depiction of something.
Ah, okay. That's a subtle but important difference.
It is. And for Scruton, this is a fundamental reason why music cannot be a representational art in the same category as painting or literature. It just operates on a different plane of meaning altogether.
This is a really crucial distinction for you as a listener, then. It encourages us to approach music on its own terms, right? To appreciate its unique expressive power without constantly needing it to tell a story or paint a picture in a literal representational sense.
Exactly. It liberates the music, allows it to speak directly through its own internal logic, its own aesthetic qualities.
Okay, so if it doesn't represent, and it's not quite like language, Scruton critiques theories that try to force music into a linguistic analogy too, doesn't he?
He does, quite robustly. He argues that while music clearly has structure, intricate structure, it is not a syntactic or semantic structure like natural language. He thinks attempts to create generative grammars for music like those by the linguists Fred Lerdahl and Ray Jackanoff, well, he thinks they ultimately fail to capture what true musical understanding really is.
Why does he think they fail?
He argues quite forcefully that a generative theory of musical structure will not deliver an account of musical understanding. For Scruton, musical rules aren't like conventional grammar rules in English that we explicitly learn and apply to form correct sentences.
What are they?
He sees them more as post facto generalizations from a tradition of musical practice. They describe what has happened repeatedly and successfully in music over centuries, what has proven effective, rather than dictating what must happen for music to be understood or considered valid. It's descriptive of a living practice, not prescriptive in a rigid foundational sense.
Okay, this relates back to the permutational versus elaborational idea.
Exactly. It brings up that critical distinction again, especially relevant for some modern music. Serial organization in atonality, for instance, is permutational. It arranges sounds in sequences based on a predetermined, often mathematical order.
Like shuffling a deck of notes.
In a way. But our natural listening grammar, as Scruton sees it, is elaborational. Yeah. When we listen, we instinctively seek out symmetries, repetitions, prolongations, things that allow our minds to build coherent, unfolding structures, to feel connections and developments.
And permutational systems don't always provide those.
Not naturally, no. And as we mentioned, cognitive psychology seems to back this up, suggesting that purely permutational arrangements are just inherently harder for us to comprehend or grasp intuitively. Our brains aren't wired for them in the same way they're wired for pattern elaboration.
That's interesting when contrasted with something like Schenkerian analysis. How does that fit in?
Schenker. Well, think of it like this. A grand building might have all sorts of decorative details, carvings, fancy windows, the surface features, but underneath there's a fundamental structural frame holding it all together.
Steel beams.
Right. Schenkerian analysis tries to find that underlying structural harmony, the fundamental harmonic and melodic backbone that Schenker believed we intuitively hear, even if it's obscured by all the surface musical ornamentation.
So it's describing what we hear unconsciously.
In a sense, yes. Schenker aims to describe the intentional object of hearing, what we perceive when we hear music correctly, according to his theory, rather than providing a psychological explanation of why we hear it that way. This means a trained analyst can use complex theoretical concepts that the average listener might not explicitly know, but they are still, Schenkerians would argue, describing the listener's actual deep perception, the underlying structure that makes the music cohere and feel meaningful.
And Scruton also points out that even standard notation can fall short here.
Yes, he notes the inadequacy of certain systems, particularly standard Roman numeral harmonic analysis, in capturing the full richness of what we perceive. It can sometimes fail to convey the subtle movement, the sculpting of tonal space that we intuitively hear.
Like what?
For example, we might hear unasserted harmonies playing across a more fundamental ruling one, meaning our ear holds on to an underlying sustained harmony, even while individual chords shift and change momentarily above or within it. Traditional notation might just show the sequence of changing chords, but it struggles to convey that layered perception, that sustained, felt harmonic presence that gives the music its depth.
This is all so insightful. It really helps you understand why some modern music, particularly serialism or highly permutational stuff, might feel less immediately graspable or satisfying. It's not just your ears being wrong.
Right. It could be a fundamental difference in how that music is organized versus how our brains are naturally geared to perceive musical structure through elaboration and expectation.
And it also shows that deep musical understanding doesn't necessarily require a PhD in theory.
Absolutely not. It requires, perhaps more importantly, a keen, attentive ear for what is actually heard in the music itself, for those deep-seated patterns, relationships, and that sense of movement.
So if music doesn't represent in the usual sense, and it's not a language like English, what kind of meaning does it have? We're circling back to Scruton's core idea here. Musical meaning is primarily about expression.
Yes, expression. And crucially, he says it's maximally context-dependent. This expression isn't something you can just decode intellectually, separate from the listening experience. It's grasped through the aesthetic experience itself.
He's quite critical of theories that say musical expression is just an analogy or a resemblance to human emotions, right?
Very critical. For example, a piece might sound sad, but Scruton argues it's not simply like sadness in the way a weeping willow tree might look sad. If it were just resemblance, he argues, you could notice the resemblance intellectually without being aesthetically affected, without being moved by it.
And that doesn't seem right for music.
Exactly. And what's more, he says a theoretically successful expression based on resemblance could still be a completely uninteresting or shallow piece of music, which would completely contradict its value as art. We don't just observe the expression in good music, we're drawn into it, affected by it.
So what is true expression for Scruton?
For Scruton, true expression penetrates the musical structure and is worked out through it. When we hear genuine expression in music, we're hearing a distinctively musical process, a kind of musical interrogation of human feeling and not the feeling itself.
A musical interrogation of feeling. What does that mean?
It means the music isn't just having an emotion like a person does. Instead, the music is exploring an emotion, shaping it, making it intelligible and understandable in a uniquely musical way through its development, its tensions and releases, its melodic contours, its harmonic colors.
Can you give an example?
Think of the really intense, raw emotions you hear in Janacek's music. Scruton mentions how you might hear a feeling of apprehension suddenly wipe away serenity, not just through the notes changing, but through the whole tonality shifting, maybe the inner voices suddenly becoming agitated. The music forces you to experience that shift, to move between contrasting aspects of emotion as the music itself changes. It's a dynamic, unfolding exploration, not just a static label like sad.
He calls these emotional qualities in music tertiary qualities, right?
Yes. They're not primary qualities like an object's physical mass or secondary qualities like its color or loudness, which depend directly on our sensory organs. Tertiary qualities like the sadness of a melody or a joyfulness of a rhythm require more.
More than just hearing.
Yes. To discern them, you need not only sensory capacities, but also intellect, imagination, perhaps even self-consciousness. He makes the insightful point that animals, while they might react to a loud noise, don't hear the sadness of a melody. It requires that higher-level cognition, that imaginative engagement, to perceive that kind of quality.
And he connects this to Hegel.
He does, drawing on Hegel's idea that The expressing of emotion is also a creating of emotion. Through artistic expression, the self-conscious subject, the person feeling or creating projects themselves, gives form to their own inner life, their own self-awareness.
So expressing helps us understand ourselves.
Precisely. It's a profound dialogue where emotions aren't just reflected passively, but are actually formed, shaped, maybe even amended or understood more deeply through the act of expression. It's how we come to grasp our own emotional landscape more fully through art.
This also leads him to a really sharp critique of what he calls sentimentalism.
Yes, he has little patience for sentimentality. He argues a sentimentalist isn't truly feeling the purported emotion, they're often avoiding genuine feeling. Their displayed emotions are like artifacts, things constructed primarily to cast credit on themselves.
To make themselves look good.
Exactly. To seek admiration or self-congratulation for being so sensitive or caring rather than engaging authentically with the emotion itself or with the actual predicament of another person, if it's sympathy, for instance. He contrasts the sincere gesture of condolence, which focuses genuinely on the other person's suffering, with a sentimental display that's really about showcasing one's own beautiful soul or depth of feeling, often performed for an audience, even an internal one. It's a performance of feeling, not the feeling itself.
And how does this relate back to listening to music?
Well, this is where it becomes quite prescriptive for us as listeners. When we describe a piece of music as genuinely moving or profoundly exciting, Scruton argues we're not just describing our own private, subjective reaction, we're implicitly recommending it.
Recommending the feeling.
Recommending the response. He argues that not to be moved by a truly moving piece is to fail to respond as the work demands. This affective language, the language of feeling and emotion we use about music, is inherently normative. It's proposing a standard of taste. It suggests there is a right way, or at least a more appropriate way, to hear and respond to a piece, and that true engagement demands a certain kind of emotional openness and discernment.
Wow. That's a powerful idea for listeners to really grapple with. It means that when music genuinely moves you, it's not just randomly triggering an emotion in you like a switch being flipped.
No.
It's actively shaping and exploring that emotion through its specific musical structure. It calls for your active participation, your imaginative involvement, and in a way it even suggests how you should feel, challenging you to distinguish what is truly moving from what might be merely manipulative or sentimental.
It absolutely does. It's an invitation to a deeper, more demanding, but ultimately more rewarding kind of listening.
Finally, let's broaden the scope and explore how music isn't just an individual aesthetic experience, but a profound reflection of our social nature and culture itself. Scruton starts this by discussing the concept of a musical work versus a performance.
Right. This is crucial for understanding how music exists over time.
To maintain the idea of a work, like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, as something distinct and enduring, something that exists beyond any single playing of it, we have to be able to differentiate the features that belong intrinsically to the work, like the notes, the rhythms, the instrumentation, from those features added by a specific performance, like tempo choices, phrasing, dynamics.
Exactly. And he notes, quite rightly, that this distinction can be harder to maintain clearly in genres like jazz or rock. There, individual performances are often considered unique versions of a song, and the underlying work itself might have less independent identity apart from its many live or recorded interpretations. The performance is the thing in many ways.
He also has some strong views on the historically authentic performance movement in classical music, doesn't he? The period instrument movement.
Oh, yes. He offers a fairly pointed critique. While acknowledging its scholarly value, he worries that it sometimes confiscates music for scholarship, elevating musicology, the study of music, over the actual living experience of the music itself.
Creating museum pieces.
That's the danger he sees, that it can create a kind of tired feeling in the audience, as if they're listening to something historically interesting but perhaps emotionally distant, a relic rather than a living voice. He finds it frankly absurd even to think of Bach as early music.
Why absurd?
Because Bach's voice, his musical thinking, still sounds incredibly fresh and relevant. It resonates powerfully in the works of modern composers like Stravinsky and Schoenberg, who studied and adapted Bach, not to mention his profound influence on giants like Mozart and Beethoven. His point is that great music transcends its specific historical context. Its core message remains vital.
So we don't need to reconstruct a living tradition.
No, because for Scruton, we are still part of it, at least potentially. He argues it's precisely because the tradition of Western tonal music still lives and breathes, even if sometimes beleaguered, that we can gain access through the music of previous generations to states of mind that we no longer encounter in our daily experience.
Like what kind of states of mind?
He gives the incredibly powerful example of listening to Tomás Luis de Victoria's Responsories for Tenebrae, this deeply spiritual choral work from the 16th century Spanish Renaissance. He says listening intently allows us to understand, perhaps even feel, exactly what it was like to believe as Victoria believed.
Wow. That's a profound claim.
It is. He finds the experience overwhelming. It redeems past time, makes vanished experiences emotionally present for us now, instructing us through our imagination in spiritual possibilities our modern lives might otherwise deny us. And this profound connection, he believes, couldn't be achieved if performance were merely a dry, scholarly reconstruction. It relies on the music's enduring expressive power, brought to life in a committed performance.
And this touches on the very identity of the musical work itself, how it persists.
Yes. While a vocal score of an opera is generally considered the same work, regardless of who sings it or how it's staged, a transcription like Schoenberg orchestrating a Bach chorale prelude might, in Scruton's view, actually become a new work if it radically changes the fundamental musical order that is heard.
So it depends on how much the core musical ideas are altered.
Right. It touches on complex philosophical debates about numerical identity, is it the exact same thing, versus qualitative similarity. How alike are they? He also discusses musical quotations, like when the famous opening motif from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde pops up, ironically, in Debussy's light-hearted Gollywog's Cakewalk.
Right, I know that bit.
Or when Shostakovich's invasion theme from his Seventh Symphony is quoted, perhaps mockingly, by Bartók in his Concerto for Orchestra. These aren't the exact same sound patterns in their new contexts, obviously, but we hear them as referring to the numerically identical original musical idea, even though they're qualitatively different now. He calls this intentional identity. Our perception of the core musical idea persists across these different manifestations.
This whole section really encourages you, as a listener, to be discerning about performance practices, doesn't it?
It does.
It highlights that true engagement with, say, classical music isn't just about historical correctness for its own sake, but about tapping into this continuous living tradition that connects us across centuries. It allows us to experience profound human truths, even ones that might otherwise be lost to time. It's about letting the music truly live and speak to us now.
Stepping back even further, Scruton looks at music's broader social and cultural role, tracing it right back from its presumed origins in dance to the modern, often silent practice of disinterested listening in a concert hall.
He brings in Plato.
He does. He references Plato, who famously believed that music directly imitates character, noble or base, chaste or licentious, and therefore had the power to shape the virtue, or lack thereof, of the youth. Plato even controversially suggested that fundamental changes in a city's musical styles could herald or even cause fundamental changes in its laws and moral fabric.
That's a huge claim, that music has direct moral and political force.
A massive claim and a controversial one throughout history. Scruton discusses dancing, perhaps music's most ancient partner, as this primal form of functionless coordination. It's a profound picture, he thinks, of our inherent social nature, something rational beings take this peculiar deep pleasure in.
Functionless, meaning it doesn't achieve any practical goal.
Exactly. It's an end in itself, like play. He invokes the philosopher Friedrich Schiller here, who saw play as the paradigm of intrinsic value, the state where man is only fully human when he plays, where he's truly free and at home with himself. Dancing, in this Schillerian sense, reveals society in a distilled form, a joyful, communal expression of being together, a vindication of our nature.
And even the modern concert hall audience.
Even the silent audience in a formal concert hall, Scruton argues, is experiencing a kind of truncated dance. You see people subtly tapping their feet, maybe swaying slightly, humming internally. They're participating physically, even if constrained.
And the applause.
And the applause. That enormous weight of social emotion that accumulates in shared, silent listening during a powerful performance is then released cathartically through applause. This reveals, he says, a powerful intimation of community. He connects this directly to Nietzsche's insight that profound aesthetic experience, particularly in its communal aspect, shares the same intimation of community that is contained in the experience of religion. It helps dispel our sense of isolation, outlining hidden common sentiments that bind us together.
But he's quite critical of how popular music evolved in the 20th century.
He is, yes. He sees a significant cultural shift, arguing that much popular music moved away from more traditional forms toward something often reduced to repeatable melodic and harmonic formula, accompanied by a continuous, often unvarying, heavy beat.
And he doesn't blame capitalism.
Interestingly, no, not primarily. He argues this was more a triumph of democracy, reflecting the rise of the new democratic man whose untutored, uninstructed tastes inevitably challenged the standards of high culture. This shift, he argues, perhaps somewhat pessimistically, unfortunately led to a decline in domestic music-making families playing instruments together and collective singing, as music became more of a passively consumed commodity and less of a participatory social act.
He contrasts Nirvana with the Beatles.
He does, somewhat provocatively. He contrasts the breathless gestures of Nirvana, which he acknowledges as powerful and raw, but perhaps limited in their harmonic and melodic development, with a song like the Beatles' She Loves You.
A simple pop song.
On the surface, yes. But Scruton argues that even a seemingly simple pop song like that moves effortlessly through the harmonic field, demonstrating sophisticated voice leading and phrases that musically answer and develop what came before. He suggests that the Beatles, like earlier figures such as Buddy Holly, represented a kind of precious icon of humanity in their time, because they genuinely seem to bridge the gap between popular appeal and real musical craft, allowing millions of people to think and feel musically with an awareness of the voice not just as a sound, but as an expression of the soul. For him, it was a moment where mass culture and genuine musicality seemed to briefly, powerfully align.
And where did music's destiny lead it, in his view?
He suggests, perhaps a bit wistfully, that music seemed to fulfill its own inner logic or destiny by gradually freeing itself from specific worldly uses and functions. Instrumental music largely took over from vocal music as the highest form, and silent, contemplative listening began to supplant communal song and dance as the primary mode of engagement, at least in the high art tradition. The human voice itself, he says poetically, was removed from the physical space of human action to reappear in the acousmatic space of music, becoming this idealized, disembodied presence, inviting us into a purely auditory, imaginative realm.
This broad cultural perspective really puts your own musical tastes and listening habits into a much wider context, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It asks you, the listener, to consider how music both reflects and potentially shapes the society around you, and how our current listening habits, maybe solitary listening through earbuds, algorithmic playlists, might connect to, or perhaps disconnect from, this rich, shared human history of music as a communal, participatory, soul-shaping activity.
It's an invitation, maybe, to seek out music, whatever the genre, that fosters that deeper musical thinking, music that truly reveals an expression of the soul, rather than just settling for background noise or sonic wallpaper.
A challenging invitation, perhaps, but a valuable one.
So as we've journeyed through some of the core ideas in Roger Scruton's The Aesthetics of Music, we've really seen how complex his vision is. Music is so much more than just organized sound.
So much more. It's an intentional object existing in that unique acousmatic space. It's a unique form of perceived movement, and it's this incredibly powerful medium of expression that really defies any simple comparison to ordinary language.
And it connects directly to our deepest social instincts, our need for community, and it reveals profound truths about who we are, both as individuals and as members of a culture.
And if, as Scruton suggests, that aesthetic experience of music holds the very same intimation of community that people often find in religious experience, and if it truly is through music that we can access these states of mind that we no longer encounter in our daily experience, bridging centuries and cultures with shared feeling,
then it leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? What does the current state of our global musical culture, and maybe more importantly, our own personal engagement with it, what does that tell us about the health of that shared human connection today?
And perhaps even more pointedly, how might we, as active, intentional listeners, consciously choose to foster a deeper, more meaningful relationship with music? Could we even play a part, however small, in helping to renew vital musical traditions, or maybe bridge some of those perceived divides between popular and classical forms? All for the sake of nurturing our collective human spirit through this incredible art form.